Move this down. All right, cool. So welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Aaron Friedman. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Propel. We have a really exciting topic today. The question is, can anyone here actually imagine a world where journalists are constantly sending you inbound pitch requests? It seems nearly unheard of. You can call it a PR fantasy, especially in a world where journalists are leaving the industry in droves. Budgets are being cut, but yet the demand for news coverage across all industries continues to climb, proving that adding value to reporters and standing out in your pitches is more important than ever, which is why I'm so excited to introduce this session that we've lovingly titled Newsjacking All Day, Every Day. And with us today, first we have Danny Groner, who leads growth PR at Forecast Labs. In his role, he shapes the marketing and messaging for Forecast Labs in both external media and internal communications. He also works closely with Forecast Labs portfolio companies to help them reach new audiences and grow their businesses through high volume SEO link building initiatives. And prior to joining Forecast Labs, Danny served at similar roles at Squarefoot, Aptiv, and Shutterstock. Welcome, Danny. Really excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. And also with us, we have, of course, Zach Cutler. He's the co-founder and CEO and chairman of Propel. Zach's a comms veteran, data enthusiast, serial entrepreneur, and angel investor. He founded Propel after running his own New York-based communications firm, Cutler, one of the top tech-focused agencies in New York, and was agency of record in the US for 70 startups, many of which are decacorns, unicorns, and many additional IPOs that were acquired in the hundreds of millions. He ran Cutler for 9 years and identified this need for innovation within the industry, selling his agency in order to pursue Propel and his dream of moving the industry forward. And he was named by Forbes as one of the 20 entrepreneurs shaking up the New York tech scene. So welcome both. I'm very excited about this webinar. A few bits of housekeeping. What we're going to talk about today is the state of journalism today, a different approach to media relations, remembering what PR is really all about, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the very end. And we're going to actually, excuse me, we're actually going to try something new. I know that many of you are probably fans of live tweeting. So we have an event hashtag here, Propel Live, which we encourage you to use throughout today's conversation, sharing any of your favorite points, takeaways, and aha moments. And we look forward to seeing them and conversing with them all on Twitter. So just really quick, a little bit about Propel. Propel was founded in 2019 and launched a CRM for PR, or what we call a PRM. And since then, we've rolled out many additional features to the core part of our platform, including the only native Gmail and Outlook email plugins, business outcomes from PR, so you can measure the ROI from your PR campaigns, as well as pitching preferences and AI-powered recommendations, so you can understand the top days of the week and times journalists like to be pitched. We're headquartered in Tel Aviv. That's where I am. I'm based in Israel. And we have teams based across the globe in New York, London, Miami, and we even have a team driving around the US in an RV, which is really cool. Propel has over 170 customers, including Real Chemistry, Textron, Insurify, and other leading brands and agencies. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Zach, and we're going to dive into the presentation a little bit more. Zach, it's all you.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks again, Danny, for joining us. Really excited for this. So I want to just start off by taking a look at where journalism is today. What are some of the implications of that on PR professionals? And want to look at kind of some trends we've been seeing about, you know, the proliferation of media outlets, yet at the same time, the shrinking of, you know, full-time media staff. So if we go to the next slide, we're seeing, and you know, a lot of people have been talking about this for some time, but a steady shrinking of, you know, employment at newspapers, at media outlets, and of course, you know, a huge rise in contributors and people that aren't necessarily paid by those outlets. So, you know, we can see that over the last, you know, almost 15 years, it's really shrunk quite significantly. Danny, do you think that we're going to continue to see this trend where, staff writers are continuing to decrease and contributors are potentially continuing to increase? What are your thoughts?
So I can't say I know the economics of this. I can certainly talk anecdotally to the sentiment I'm hearing from reporters. More often than not, when I sit down with reporters and I tell them a little bit about what I do and how I do it and how I think about the industry, they tell me sort of, earnestly that they're one bad mood away from leaving the industry altogether. Now, I don't think that we'll ever see a shortage of entry-level pipeline. I do think the mid-career people 10, 15 years into their careers, are starting to reassess what do I do with all of these skills and this background instead, to not only make more money, but to honestly find more meaning in the work. And the way that I think about this is that this problem has probably always existed, hence why I and many, many others have switched out of journalism and into PR. But I think what has opened up is more possibility beyond just being a PR person. In fact, if I were in the same predicament myself in my late 20s or early 30s today, I wouldn't become a PR person today. That pool is overcrowded. I would actually go into what we call VC content, venture capital communications, where you're actually a journalist, so to speak, in-house at a venture capital firm. And I know journalists who are actively making those switches today. And I think that's one of the other avenues available that we have sort of won, the sort of battle for relevance in terms of what do you do with an English degree, what is journalism worth, and so on. And there's a blessing and a curse that comes with that. The journalists are paying attention and they're realizing that they don't have to be a journalist with a capital J anymore, that there are a lot more options for them to do more beyond just copywriting or content marketing or executive ghostwriting. They can actually go work for a for-profit company and maintain the integrity and the rigor of what they set out to do, but they don't necessarily have to do it for a media publication anymore. And where I'll end my comments is I think that that's why we're seeing the rise of Substack. It's not that people necessarily say, to hell with journalism, I'm going to go be independent. It's that probably some, if not all of those people were actually born into this world to be entrepreneurs in addition to being journalists, and that Substack has created an opportunity that other generations didn't have. So what I believe will happen is we'll start to see a shortage of veteran journalists in their 40s, 50s, 60s, those grizzled veterans that can tell the war stories, because probably more in the next generation than we've ever seen before, those people will no longer be journalists with a capital J, but flexing those same muscles in other outlets.
Wow, that's so well said, and I couldn't agree more. And I love, in general, the sort of, for lack of a better word, democratization of pretty much everything. And so, whereas 20, certainly 50 years ago, being a journalist was with a capital J is a very specific, formal career track. And I couldn't agree with you more that now, the investigative journalism that everyone still wants and consumes is just being created by a wider array of people that aren't necessarily journalists with a capital J, but a lot of contributors, freelancers, etc. So, but I love the way that you articulated that, and it's kind of a good, if we go to the next slide, it's a good segue into some of the reasons that that we think people have left the industry. Obviously, humankind is very curious, and there's never going to be a replacement for people wanting to consume journalist type content. But like you said, it's just being created by different types of people, and to go even further, by different types of companies and media outlets. And so I think it's just sort of a shift where, because there isn't as much money, there isn't as much centralization in sort of traditional media outlets like a newspaper. We're seeing the content spring up in all these more modern channels, like a blog, like Reddit, like so many other, a Twitter handle, wherever whoever it might be. Any thoughts, Danny, on other reasons why people have left or continue to leave the journalism industry?
So I'll share my own personal story of this. I was in my late 20s working in a newsroom here in New York City and doing the job that at the time I thought I was born to do. I was a curator of the news. By today's standards, you might call it an audience development manager. And I was quite skilled at understanding what the 15 to 20 articles we would publish, each day looked like, and sort of managing the workflow, and then also flexing muscles to drive people to our website. And then once they were on our website, to keep them and nurse them and have them click multiple articles. And I loved the repackaging of the news and discussing the next day's story and arguing over the best headline in a viral SEO driven type of world. And I could tolerate the low pay and the working on weekends because I was passionate about it. But what ultimately chased me out of journalism had nothing to do with anything on these slides. What it was ambition. And my feeling on this is that if all you could imagine you can do in this world is be a better and better writer, editor, there's no better place to spend your whole career than a newsroom. But what happened to me is that I was curious about what else was going on, not just within the industry, but at our own company. And you would think that the curiosity that journalists are known for it would be harnessed, not suppressed. And I found that as I was looking at the business side of the operation and getting to know the people on the marketing team and wanting to have more direct knowledge about how the business was faring and talking directly to executives in charge, the editorial director at the time sat me down and said, "That's not what you're here for." And he really wanted me to stay in my cubicle under my headphones working on the website. And that ultimately was what chased me out of journalism. And it really hit me like a ton of bricks because I really wanted to do more. I thought I was capable of more. I wanted to be more than just my set of responsibilities at that very moment. But it became very clear to me that I was being told very sternly, stay in your lane. And what I often say when I relay that story to other people and why I knew it was time to leave journalism is that I have no regret over leaving journalism a decade plus ago, but I still harbor a lot of sadness that I had to.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's such an interesting story, and it really, in a way, resonates with me because it's, journalism and PR are two sides of the same coin. And, having spent my whole career in PR, there's a lot of things and a lot of the way that the industry thinks and the old-fashioned sort of non-innovative, sort of old-school approaches to things that got me frustrated with where my agency was. We were doing great. We had 15 people. We had amazing tech clients, big companies, but I was looking at, our workflow and how our agency actually runs. And I was saying, why is there no CRM or management software for PR? Like, why are we managing our relationships with thousands of journalists in spreadsheets? This is insane. And it wasn't just us, it was everybody. 99% of PR people still do that. And I felt like this industry has amazing potential. It's a great creative industry, but we have to bring more innovation. We have to bring more data, more insights. And I remember even my own employees used to laugh at me when I said that we should make our campaigns more data-driven. They used to scoff, like, data-driven. Oh my God, what's he talking about? And so it's very interesting to hear you say that kind of you felt a similar thing on the journalism side, and it makes a lot of sense because it really is two parts of the same ecosystem.
Yeah, and what I'll say, just sort of segueing to the next stage or chapter of my career, when I left journalism, I really left journalism. I went to work at a tech company that at the time, unbeknownst to me, was pre-IPO, and I saw it through its best years of the company's evolution, but that really was not my plan. My plan was just to find a safe place to land. And I never really had a backup plan in mind because it was going to be journalism all the way. And what I often talk about is what happens when you get the job you always wanted and it turns out you don't like it? And I think that that's what is really very much top of mind for a lot of people these days with this so-called great resignation. I don't think people are impulsive or lazy or want to retire at 27 years old. I do think that for a lot of businesses, journalism and many others, it wasn't what you were promised, or maybe what you promised yourself it would be. So when I left journalism, I wasn't looking to do journalism for a brand. I wasn't looking to be a content marketer or a copywriter. I actually left to go reinvent myself as a digital marketer. And I was hired as a partnership manager for Shutterstock, the stock photo company, in order to really leave behind journalism and try to learn, can you teach an old dog new tricks? And it was only through really fortune that I was able to blend the two many years later, that for 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, I was really a partnership manager. Of course, I was writing emails, to suggest partnerships, but certainly was not journalism. I was working with bloggers who were doing journalism with a lowercase j. But by 2014, I got very lucky that Shutterstock hired a VP of communications who took a look at how I had spent my 20s as a journalist and how I was beginning my 30s as a partnership manager, really on a growth marketing team. And she was the first person to suggest, you should be a PR person. And I rebuffed those suggestions because I think of PR people as one thing, and I certainly was not one of those people. I didn't come through agency. That's not where my ambition was. I don't want to do brand building and news announcements and crisis communications. I'm the last person you want in your Slack war room if something's going wrong. I'm trying to deal with my own anxiety. I don't want the additional anxiety of a crisis. And she said to me, you're actually better at PR already than you realize, and what you don't know, I'll fill in for you. And she really gave me a year-long boot camp in more corporate-minded PR to write press releases and do executive brand building and so on. But it became clear to me as I was evolving to become a PR person that I was not a corporate PR person. And what I set out to do was blend those two halves of my professional self. And I actually launched a category of PR I call growth PR that really only exists in my own imagination, but it takes me away from having to think about the brand building, the news announcements, and the crisis communications, and really harnesses all of the talents and abilities and skills and ambition I do have, which is to essentially be the quiet puppet master behind the scenes, suggesting the right stories to the right publications at the right time that happen to include my own company's interests.
Yeah, I love that. And if we go to the next slide, so at Propel, we built the first and only Gmail and Outlook plugins in the industry. And I knew when I sold my agency and started Propel, I knew that one of the big differentiators that we had to have was bringing email into a PR person's native environment, which is Gmail or Outlook. And I knew from my employees and myself that I never went into Cision or Meltwater and pitched from within the platform. I would always export my list and then pitch from my Gmail. And 99% of PR people do that. And so I said, why don't we bring Propel into Gmail, and then we'll be able to capture the open rates, the response rates, the publish rates, and so much other amazing data, and pull it back into reports and everything, so PR people can see which campaigns are performing well. And so that's one of the things that Propel does. And when we looked at over hundreds of thousands of pitches here, I think it's actually close to 2 million pitches between last year and this year, what we've been noticing is a very consistent trend that is concerning and that's not surprising, which is that the average response rate is going down quarter after quarter after quarter, year after year after year. We've been doing our media barometer now for a year and a half, and we just keep seeing the response rate go down further and further. And you kind of got to wonder, if it keeps going down at this rate, it's going to reach zero in not too long. What's going on here? I mean, how can we turn things around in addition to, of course, using a PRM, how can PR people turn things around so that they get more responses from journalists and that we reverse this trend?
So I'm a newcomer to this industry, but I think that actually gives me an advantage over others. It's a feature, not a bug. And what I'll say about this through the journalist perspective, as somebody that's sort of posing as a PR person, is that I think 5 years ago, or even probably 15 years ago, reporters were saying to PR people, just send me news, I'll write about the news. And I think where that blew up in the faces of the relationship between both parties is when you saw the Theranoses and the WeWorks of the world using the reporters to convey a certain narrative around those companies that not only was not accurate, it actually helped them to sort of leapfrog beyond where the companies actually were. There wasn't enough scrutiny or skepticism on the part of the reporters during that era. And what you saw is the pendulum swing completely in the other direction, where there was so much scrutiny and so much skepticism and so much second guessing that you're starting to see reporters say, it's not enough to cover a Series A news announcement. I need you to show me what's going on underneath the hood. I need the valuation. I need more. Give me data. I can't run the story without the full picture, because the last thing in the world the reporters want to do is to get burned and be perceived of as the ones that weren't asking the right questions and were just being used, so to speak. And what I'll say about this is that I wasn't pitching 5 years ago those self-serving, opportunistic growth stories on behalf of the early stage startups. But I actually think the pendulum swinging in the other direction has played well to my approach, because what I wasn't doing or never was doing was building a limited number of relationships transactionally with 10 or 20 reporters who would do me a favor because I was texting a reporter. In fact, I can't think of a single reporter's phone number who's in my phone. I don't have those relationships. I've always thought about, is this a good idea? Is there a larger feature here? And that's the direction that I think we started to see PR go over the last 2 years, is that the reporters, at least that I'm in touch with, are really never taking cold pitches about companies. They see that as spammy more than they see that as helpful. The types of stories that I started pitching, 5 years ago and have continued to lean into are actually ones where I recognize in a humble way my company is not deserving of its own standalone profile, even if we did have a Series A news announcement or a product update, because at the end of the day, it's an unknown company and it's not newsworthy. So what I try to think about is how to beat the reporter to the spot. That reporter didn't wake up this morning hoping that I would send them something that sounds self-serving and helps Danny get a raise, but doesn't help their consumer. What I try to think about is, how do I contextualize? How do I take what I'm being told by the company I represent and put it in a broader focus, use it as a breadcrumb to tell a bigger story where 100% of the time my company will not be name checked in the headline, but how do I punch above our weight class by pitching something where we are one of several different industry experts, better for me if it is the leading experts, and then our company magically lands in the 7th paragraph with a quote. That to me is a win. So I want to be in as many stories as I can in top tier outlets, in important industry trades. But for me, it's much more starting from, what is the highest ranking website that can help me for SEO link building? What publication doesn't cover this industry, but I'd like to get us coverage in it because the window to cover it might be once a year, but when that window opens, I gotta seize it. So what I'm not doing is starting from, what do I have to announce and who can tell it? I'm doing the opposite, from what do the publications cover, which reporters work there, what breadcrumbs might they drop on Twitter or in email with me about what they're already exploring or working on, or even better, I got to know them so well sensibility-wise from reading their other coverage that I can guess what they're going to be looking at next. And that's the direction I'm seeing this industry go over the last 2 years in particular. But I've taken it up a notch even as recently as last month. What I'm realizing now that I'm a step removed from the portfolio companies that I support is that I actually don't know the day-to-day of what's happening at the 5 portfolio companies that are my clients, so to speak. And again, I look at that as a feature, not a bug. So in the last 6 weeks or so, I've actually done away with pitching anything at all. And I'm just reading Twitter and reading the news and going to the home pages of the most well-known websites and trying to figure out who are my types of reporters that are writing about topics that I, as a consumer, am interested in. And I happen to be a PR person in parentheses, and then just literally reaching out to the reporter and saying, I loved your coverage about X. And then one paragraph very casually saying, here's a little bit about me. I'm a good resource for you to lean on when you're looking to flesh out an idea or you need an anecdote to lead your story. So what I'm not doing is trying to guess what the reporter's interested in. I was doing a lot of that 2 years ago, and some of it worked, but much of it did not. But even better is if I reach out to reporters and say, lean on me. And then the reporters who I've never pitched before find it refreshing. It's not 20% of reporters, might be 3% of reporters, but those 3% of reporters that say, I'd love to have a phone call to learn more about your portfolio companies. This morning, I had breakfast with a Wall Street Journal reporter who I didn't know existed a week ago. And I know we're going to do real good business together because I wasn't selling her on anything. In fact, she said to me over breakfast, if I did what you do, I'd do it the way that you do it. You wouldn't believe how much spam I get sent, even on my beat, that I would never write about. So I'm very much leaning forward, 6 months, 12 months down the line about how can I be a helpful resource to as many reporters across a wide variety of beats that they think of me when they can't think of anybody else, when they have a gap in their coverage. And then I start with my portfolio companies where I do have self-serving needs. But even when I can't fill their gap with my existing portfolio, I'm happy to jump into a Slack group with other PR people and give it away to one of them. Because what I want to do is answer the call and deliver the solution so that they keep sending me this stuff. My job gets a lot easier when the stuff is inbound rather than outbound.
Yeah, you put a big smile on my face because that's absolutely, I couldn't agree more, the absolute best way to do PR. And I remember when I used to be in the trenches doing media relations every day, I also used that tactic of, how can I help you? What sources are you looking for? And almost change it so that the relationship is one where the journalist can be like, yeah, Danny can help me find a source for XYZ, or Danny can help me with whatever. And then all of a sudden you become an asset and you're like in demand by the reporters, which is an amazing shift. So that's awesome. And it seems like you've really decided to focus 100% on that at Forecast Labs. So if we go to the next slide, do you want to tell us a little bit more about sort of how the path to inbound works? You've touched on it in the last few minutes, but any other sort of specifics that you can share with, we have over 500 registrants to this webinar, so any other specifics you can share with everyone?
Yeah, I'm actually going to segue to some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat because I've talked about this a little bit at the macro level, but I want to break it down with some details. So whenever I sit down with a junior PR person or a CEO of an early stage business, I always say there are 3 buckets of reporters. There's the first bucket of reporters that are your top tier publications that cover your industry, and there are important industry trades. So let's say there are 8 to 12 reporters that you really want to be in. You're probably not ready yet to pitch them something directly, but you're certainly able to begin to build a relationship with them that they turn to you when you need something. In fact, from the reporters that I've spoken to who write about those types of businesses, they would prefer to hear directly from somebody at the company, even if they're not a PR people, often especially because they're not a PR person, because they resent that there are early stage businesses paying the bounty of $15,000 plus on something like PR when the company just isn't mature enough to be spending $15,000 a month on PR. And there's a lot of icky PR agencies out there that are sort of manipulative in that regard. They know that that CEOs are desperate for the press, and they position themselves as the gatekeeper between you and getting that press. And those relationships sometimes work out, but they often end with the CEO feeling that they were overpromised and underdelivered on. And it's because probably that company is not mature enough or far enough along or doesn't have interesting enough stuff going on to be able to get the types of stories that the PR person promised. But that doesn't mean that the CEO or somebody else at the company can't be cited in a top tier publication or an important industry trade. So what I often say is start those slow and steady. That's very much traditional. You want to send an email to the reporter, as I alluded to before. Hey, Jennifer, I really enjoyed your story today about such and such. I think you really nailed some of the nuances and complexities of where the industry transition is. Next paragraph. It reminded me a lot of what I'm building here. Name check your company, put the website, some of the topics that might be of interest to you now and going forward that we can speak to are X, Y, and Z. And the most important thing about doing it that way is not just in terms of relationship building, but there are two really critical things to consider. The first is your goal there is not for them to email you back and say, you're right, I want to write about you today. It's to get a response. You're flattering them in hopes that they say, thanks so much for reading. I'll keep you in mind. The I'll keep you in mind is not disingenuous. It feels that way, but the goal is that you have a two-way correspondence, because 5 months from now, when you do have news that you want them to write about or an interesting piece of data or anecdote and so on, you can jump back onto that same chain. They certainly will not remember you, but if you have an existing chain, it goes a long way to have a second piece of correspondence rather than pitching them in the dark. So that's the first thing. The second thing is lots of reporters use their email inboxes the way that we all use Google searches. So the more you can sort of stuff keywords reasonably into that initial correspondence to them, reporters have said to me over and over again that they glance over the pitch and they might not respond, but 4 months from now when they're searching their inbox for something that you're an expert on, cybersecurity or crypto or whatever, they might actually hop back onto that same chain because you surface. So there are two real goals there that are long-term plays in terms of relationship building that have nothing to do with grabbing coffee with them and everything to do with staying top of mind when you have something for them. Somebody asked about HARO, and I just want to take a quick pause on this. So HARO, for those that don't know what it is called Help a Reporter Out, and there are 3 daily digests of where reporters literally identify what they're working on. I was getting tons and tons of HARO opportunities several years ago when I was doing SEO link building for Shutterstock and on behalf of other companies. HARO has sort of dried up for me. I still read it, I still respond to it, but I can't tell you the last time something came through HARO. What I use HARO for is 2 things today. One is an intellectual exercise. When you have a junior PR person who has to figure out what is and what isn't a story, there's no better opportunity than 3 times a day combing through 200 real examples about what is a story that reporters work on, just to train your brain in a very short period of time to understand what reporters do write about. So for me, HARO today is not necessarily for PR placements. It's much more to sort of stay in the game. I use it as batting practice, so to speak. I respond to 3 to 10 HAROs a day. I never hear from those reporters these days, and its impact is overstated by today's standards. The second thing that I'll say about HARO is HARO will identify for me particularly freelance writers by name in HARO that I don't respond in the HARO to the thing that they posted, but I do connect with them separately where I got their names. And that's like a database that's free to me because I'm trying to sort of wing it and figure out, who are the people that I should be responding to or reaching out to, I should say. So as Zach alluded to 30 minutes ago, there are more and more freelancers today, and it's harder and harder to find them, and there's no real great database of freelance reporters, and especially across many beats like I do. So what I try to use HARO for is to identify who are the reporters that I should be reaching out to. And I've had a lot of success over recent years, not just through HARO, but with freelancers in general. I prefer to pitch freelancers more than I prefer to pitch in-house people, as counterintuitive as that sounds. But I feel that the freelance reporters are more on my team. There's less likelihood of a story going sideways because the reporters are incentivized to pitch things, get them, and to write a positive story. about myself and or my team and so on, my industry, than you would find from an in-house journalist who might be more investigative and might be more labor intensive, might be slower and so on. So I'm not trying to denigrate anybody in the industry, but I would recommend pitching interns and freelancers and the people that are sort of on the outside of the business who are really trying to hustle to get placements, might write more often because the money only trickles in very slowly. And the best thing about freelancers is they often write for multiple publications. So if you can make a relationship with them, not only can you get backlink from one website, but they might think of you for other clients or even the same client for other publications as well. So Zach, if I didn't answer your direct question, please restate it, but I wanted to acknowledge those questions from the chat.
No, that's really helpful. And if anyone, everyone who's interested in a better version of Haro, please type yes in the chat. And I'll tell you why in a minute. We have the yeses rolling in: Benjamin, Allison, Gabriella, Mark, Erica, Coco. Oh my God, I can't even keep up. I think about 30 of the 30 or so yeses just rolled in. At Propel, we're actually working on something really exciting that I can't say too much about, but that's going to be coming out in the next few months. And we will reach out to anyone who writes yes in the chat about participating in our beta for that. It will be something that I think will be quite interesting for you. Wow, lots of more yeses rolling in. I think we've got about 50 to 60 now. Mark says, boom. Yes.
Hey, Zach, can I just jump back in for a second? I realized I glossed over something.
Yes, Daniel.
So I had, before I got into the topic of Haro, I had mentioned there are 3 categories of reporters that you can reach out to, and you should build relations with top tier. I want to fill in the other 2 categories. Second tier publications that cover the industry are ripe for the picking. You don't need to have relationships with them. In fact, many of those reporters are always on deadline. They have to write multiple times a day. It's their very nature that they need to hear from PR people in the field. And you can get very quick hits by not focusing exclusively on how do we get the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg to write about us, but you can get an industry publication. So the one that comes to mind for me is we have a prop tech company that, you know, it's all about mortgages. And when I started working with them, I immediately pitched a publication that has been very friendly to me, but I wouldn't read otherwise, which is called Mortgage Professional America, mpamag.com. And the reporters there are wonderful to deal with because not that they'll take anything, but they certainly are less scrutinizing than what the Wall Street Journal mortgage reporter will cover, where they're only writing twice a week at best. But if you have a reporter who's writing twice a day and is trying to struggle in the middle of the afternoon to come up with something else, it almost doesn't matter what you send them. If you're an interesting company that they're unfamiliar with, they're far more likely to write about you. And where I think about this is I want everything. I don't only want the Wall Street Journal. If I was only judged on getting the top tier publications, I'd be fired by the time I got the Wall Street Journal. So I think about this as you got to hit a lot of singles and doubles if you're going to earn the home runs. You get 2 or 3 home runs a year, and then you got to go work on the next home run. But all of us are responsible in between for those 3-4 months in between to still have a natural amount of coverage. It might come from Mortgage Professionals America to keep you in your seat to be able to earn the bigger ones. So there are probably 8 to 12 or 20 reporters in that second tier that you should be thinking about that you really can pitch this afternoon if you have something worthwhile to say. You don't have to build those relationships. And again, it should come directly from somebody at the company. The third and final category is where I'm sorry, go ahead.
I love that. Yeah, I got to say, you have such a refreshing approach to PR, and a lot of the things that you're saying are things that perhaps some of us have done in the past, but there's certain pearls of wisdom here that I've never even heard or thought of or done ever. Like, I love what you were saying about including sort of keywords in your pitch, so that when a journalist goes back and searches for that term, Bitcoin or crypto or whatever, even months later, you can appear as a source. I love that. And if we go to the capitalizing on contrarian viewpoints slide, the next slide, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you use, contrarian viewpoints to kind of get attention or, pique interest of journalists.
So Zach, you gave me a great segue. I see people asking, they want to know the third bucket. So the third bucket is very much along these lines. So the third bucket is everybody else. A lot of PR agencies and PR people tend to be very narrow in terms of where they see opportunity. You know, as I said, there are 8 to 12 top tier, there's 8 to 20, so you've got 30. So I think a lot of PR people, maybe even some people on this call might say, yeah, that's the limit of my media list. I can only have relationships with 30 people. And I say, no, you need to have relationships with 300 people. It's just that those 270 other reporters don't realize yet they should be using you as a resource. So I can give a whole bunch of examples of this, but it very much starts from this contrarian perspective. What I don't advise is taking on a contrarian or counterintuitive or different or unusual approach for your business in hopes of getting press. What I do advise is keeping an ear open, that when you're in meetings or in conversations with people, or just have a bright idea when you're in the shower or going for a walk, it's the more contrarian positions that you already have that reporters want to hear from you about. Now, that doesn't mean 100% of the time you need to be pitching it. But for me, close to, if not 100% of the time, it's when we have contrarian positions that I'm ready to pitch. The classic slogan they use in journalism for those of us who start in journalism is dog bites man happens every day. That's not going to be on your local news, but man bites dog, that's a story that leads the local news because a man doesn't bite a dog in your neighborhood every day, right? So that third bucket is what I would call everybody else, the et cetera category. And the way to sort of begin to think about where your stories live is using what I call Venn diagrams. We have a circle of things that I'm just loading up in my notebook and in my brain. And then I'm going out into the world via Twitter, email, and every other way, sometimes, you know, having breakfast with reporters and trying to figure out what are they interested in? What do they cover? What are they exploring? And then figuring out the connective tissue between what I've loaded up in my brain and what they say they're interested in, and finding that slim but often significant middle. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. My favorite example of this is in 2020, I found myself consulting for, of all things, a dog company. Now, I'm not a dog person. I don't have a dog. I'll never have a dog, and I'm not excited by dogs. For reasons I don't understand, when I'm around dogs, they're very excited to see me, which makes my wife laugh a lot, okay? I happened to be consulting for a dog company, and I said to the chief marketing officer, I'm going to level with you. I don't know anything about dogs. I don't know any dog publications. I'm not interested in pitching dogs, but I'm interested in learning more about your business. And remember, this was May 2020. And I said, my understanding is that dogs have gone through the roof. There's so much demand, not enough supply. How's your business? She says, it's crazy. It's impossible to keep up with this. I said, what's the supply chain issue? And so on. She said, there are so few ways that we can actually ship these dogs. You're not going to believe it, but we're chartering private flights to send the dogs to their destination. I said, wait, there are dogs riding on private jets? And she said, yeah, on occasion. And I said, I'm going to pitch that, but that's not a dog story. That's a travel story. And sure enough, I got that placement in the New York Times. It was a story not about dogs. It was a story about how people were chartering private flights to get to their destination once you couldn't get on a flight or was deemed unsafe to get on a flight. But there was a mention in that New York Times article about even dogs are getting on private flights. And I'm telling you, that company had no business of being in the New York Times at that time because there just wasn't enough interest in the company. There were other leading, people in the industry that the reporters would cover sooner than they would talk about the dogs. But once it was a travel story that intersected with dogs, we were the best and the brightest. I'll give you an example more relevant to my day-to-day experience. March 9th, 2020 was a Monday. It was very scary to go to work. I was in the office. Of all things, I was working for an office space company. And I like to be in the office. I'm in the office today. I overhear, eavesdrop, on conversations. I learn more about the business from what I hear than what I get at weekly all-hands meetings. So I overhear one of our junior brokers coming back from an office tour says to his manager, our director of brokerage, it's really weird out there. These people come through our online funnel. I email with them 3 times. I go to meet them and they refuse to shake my hand. I can't build a rapport with people in a business setting without shaking their hand. I don't know what to do. And it suddenly dawns on me, there's a story here about tension, transition, before and after. These are things that journalists are naturally drawn to. Business as usual, we all know this from representing CEOs, you're never going to get into the story. But I'm trying to do my job despite this pandemic coming in, and I can't shake hands with people, and this is interfering with my ability to do business as usual. That's a story from what I eavesdropped. So I didn't pitch this as a real estate story. This is a bigger story. This is about everybody, right? What's a world without hugs and handshakes? So I didn't have a media list for hugs and handshakes, right? So I go to Google News and I just type in coronavirus society. Which reporters have already shown that they're pivoting their beat to cover this type of tension that we're experiencing this week? And I found Ashley Fetters at The Atlantic, now at the Washington Post, and I pitched her a story that Monday afternoon. 5 minutes later, Ashley, who's never heard from me before, who's never heard of the company I work at, doesn't care about commercial real estate because they don't write about it at The Atlantic, says to me, Danny, I'm literally writing that story right now. I need a lead anecdote about exactly what you're describing. Can I talk to your director of brokerage at 4 o'clock? The story was live the next day at 4 o'clock. It was a perfect story for us. We were half the story because we were the lead anecdote about how weird it is out there where you need to do handshakes to do the very business that we do. For me, it was a domain authority 90 with a backlink that the window wouldn't have opened otherwise. If I pitch Ashley or anybody else at The Atlantic a story about commercial real estate, I'm marked as spam. But I had to sort of time the market in the right way that I had something for the first and only time that Ashley would actually write about. But the only way I find that is I really understand and can overhear what's going on in the business. So what I'll say about that third bucket of the et cetera category, it's my favorite bucket. It's what I've leaned my whole career into, to just be a resource in all the stuff that has nothing directly to do with the business. But the only way you can do what I call growth PR is to be active, embedded, immersed in the business. You can't do this as an outside consultant. You have to just be somebody that's willing to have hallway conversations with junior people, people that are talking to customers on the phone, learning about how are people using this product unexpectedly. What's the data showing that went a different direction than what we would have predicted? So what I did when I was in-house at startups is I created moles inside of all of those businesses. It doesn't serve me well to attend all of those meetings. In fact, if I'm in the data meeting and the thing is staring at me on the wall, I'm not going to see it. But I said to Haley, the 26-year-old data analyst, once a month, you're going to see something in a meeting you're in that I'm not in. And it's going to make you turn your head sideways and say, I wouldn't have thought it would go that way. And I want your instinct as soon as that happens to come to my desk and tell me what it is. And we can decide together if there's a larger narrative about the industry. And we're the ones with the data point, the breadcrumb, the tidbit to be able to pitch something much bigger about the nature or the future of this industry. And I can't find those things without the support of my colleagues who are much better than I am at customer care and data and everything else. And I'm just the person filtering and curating what is actually interesting to reporters and going and finding the right reporters to write about those things.
Yeah, I love that. By the way, we're getting some great feedback in the chat that Mark said this is great stuff, really eye-opening. We got to have you on more often, Danny. Before we open up for Q&A in a minute, because we're running out of time, I just want to say a quick shout out about Propel. Just launched our free version, which we're really excited about. It's a first for the industry to have a end-to-end PR software that's free. Of course, there's limitations. We want you to upgrade, so you're not going to get everything for free, but you can get a ton of value from our PRM, which is our public relations management system. It's essentially CRM for PR, from our database, from our monitoring, from our social listening. So I encourage all of you to check that out at propelmypr.com/free. And with that said, I will pass it back to Aaron to open up Q&A.
All right, that was awesome. That was really amazing. We have some really great questions here. We are running out of time, so we're going to try to go through them quickly. And anything that we don't get a chance to cover, we'll be covering in follow-up blog posts or whatever else we can get to try to answer those questions as well. So the first question that we have here is, would you say that being a former journalist has made you significantly better PR pro, Danny? How could PR people learn some of these behind the scenes skills?
So the short answer is yes, and the long answer is yes. I'm enthusiastic about news. That's the commonality in everything I've done. My news obsession is what sets me apart and why CEOs and people in positions of influence want to work with me. 4 hours ago, sitting at breakfast with a Wall Street Journal reporter, she literally told me, I can tell from the pitches that I get which PR people came through news and which PR people came through not news. And it's not to say that like one is better than the other. They're different. There's opportunity with different reporters, with different assets and, and skills and ambitions that you have. In the corner of journalism meets PR that I participate in, there's no other way to do it. But if somebody only wants crisis communications, brand building, and so on, you're actually better off with somebody that didn't come through news, who understands the landscape a lot better than I could do that work.
Awesome. One of the questions we have over here is, what are some of your best practices in newsjacking quickly and frequently without mistakenly creating negative press?
So the mistakenly creating negative press, I just want to take a moment to talk about. It certainly creates more liability. The way the PR agency model is sort of set up is we're going to go after 15 things this year. We'll go 15 for 15, and you should say we crushed it. And my response is, yeah, you got 15 things like you promised, but why didn't you go after 50 things? And they would say, well, it's impossible to go 50 for 50. And I would agree. But I'll go 47 for 50. And at the end of the year, I'll say I got 30 plus more things than you. And 3 of them went sideways and I was embarrassed about them. And I wish I hadn't done them and I'll have to do the cleanup. But the difference between my approach and the PR agency approach is I think PR agencies are perfectly capable of getting 50 things. They're just afraid they're going to lose the account. That if one thing doesn't go their way, they're going to lose the business. And I don't operate from a place of fear. I operate from a place of strength, which is why it's so important to me to be in-house, that I have the trust of people above me that they know something's going to go sideways and we'll have to clean it up. But I'm not worried when that inevitably happens that I'm going to lose my job or damage my credibility or have to change on the fly, because they're judging me at the end of the year on volume and they'll forgive me for the things that didn't go my way. Now, can you go back to the first question of the two-parter?
What would you say that being a former journalist has made you significantly better PR pro?
No, sorry. I meant the next question. You asked me a two-part question. I handled the second half first.
Yeah. So the two, what are some of the best practices? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that. What are the best practices for newsjacking?
Exactly.
Okay. The best practices for newsjacking is read the news. I have a 1-hour team meeting on Mondays and a 30-minute one-on-one with my manager on Tuesdays, and I'm in control of the other 38 plus hours that I work. And I have a full calendar, but it's full of things that I opted for, including this past hour that I spent with you guys. And for me, the priority is not necessarily more access to our portfolio companies and being in more meetings there or on behalf of Forecast Labs. My goal is to spend those 38 hours being a better thinker. And the best way to become a better thinker is to read. And I spend most of my day interacting with journalists, but also reading what reporters are actually writing about and training and retraining and overtraining my brain to be able to really understand where the public sentiment is, what reporters really want to hear. They drop breadcrumbs, I DM them and I say, if you're interested in writing about this topic, I've got somebody for you. I'm just trying to throw as many darts as I can. And the only way I see the dartboard is through actually being embedded in what's going on in the cultural conversation. So I'm not saying people should drop their direct reports and drop their other responsibilities. Certainly you should harness those, but you also need to make time to be able to be immersed in the cultural conversation. You can't, where I'll end this is, the worst way to come up with good ideas is to have a creative brainstorm. The best way to find good ideas is to talk to people.
Okay. So one of the questions that actually I think ties in with that really well is, if you're a new PR person at a company, do you recommend sending an introduction via email or Twitter to the company's media list? We actually got this on one of our previous webinars where journalists were actually, a lot of journalists were, or some journalists were saying that they don't like to be contacted on Twitter at all. Keep it on email. I don't want to hear from you on Twitter. I'm there for something else.
So it obviously depends, but overwhelmingly email is the #1 source. I find that once you become known to them as somebody that is daily involved with their Twitter, they open up. They really just don't want to be spammed by people they don't know in Twitter DMs, but certainly reporters that you have a healthy banter with on a regular basis, you can send them DMs. What I wouldn't advise though is copying and pasting a 4-paragraph pitch into a DM. So I'll give you an example of yesterday. Marty Swant, who used to be at Forbes and is now at Digiday, tweeted something last night. And I know Marty a little bit just via Twitter. I've met him once at a New York City media event, but he wouldn't remember me by name and face. But I know that the thing that he tweeted is something we can speak to. I think it would be a little bit strange for me to copy and paste the URL from the tweet and then to pitch him something. I more just pinged him saying, hey, Marty, I saw your tweet. You're 100% right. If you're ever interested in writing about this subject, it's something that we can speak to. Marty didn't respond to me, but I don't think he didn't respond to me because I was bothering him. I think he either didn't read it or he's not interested in writing about that. And I just move on. I have been chastised, though, from New York Times reporters that have done something similar. I've tweeted something that is of interest to me, and then I pitched them via DM, lightly, and I have been chastised saying, never pitch me via DM again. And that's very startling and scary. None of us want to be the PR person who's named and shamed and screenshotted, on Twitter. So my answer is mostly use email. If you have a relationship with them, you can slide into DMs and, pitch them there ever so slightly. It's a different approach, a different tone, but for the most part, just use good judgment and follow your instincts.
Awesome. We are all out of time. So really, Danny, thank you so much. Danny, Zach, thank you guys so much for this. This was really great. So informative. If anyone has any questions, again, thank you so much for joining our webinar. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email me directly, aaron@propelmypr.com, or check us out. If you want to check out a demo, if you want to try freemium, feel free. We'd love to get to know you and see what we can do to help. And look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Aaron, for having me. And if anybody wants to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I'm happy to continue the conversation online or offline. Just feel free to reach out and let me know you were attending this.
Absolutely. We will. It's Danny Groner at Twitter, right?
Yeah, Danny Groner on Twitter, and LinkedIn shouldn't be too hard to find either.
All right, great.
Take care, everyone.